Right, my friends. Um, a little bit of background, a little bit of personal story. I think I must have been around 10 or 11, I can't remember, when I first went to a service of the Stations of the Cross. I know where it was because it was in Coventry and it was with my nana. And I was taken just with her and nobody else, as far as I can remember. Although I did often go and stay with my nan and granddad on my own, to the local Catholic church as part of an ecumenical week of Holy Week services. And as is often true around the Catholic Church, there were stations of the cross all around the walls. And I can't remember anything that was said. All I can remember is getting totally confused as to when I should stand up, when I should bow, when I should sit, when I should kneel, and kept having to turn round as the priest gradually worked his way round all the stations. But it stuck with me, and I can still, in my mind's eye, see the event, which says something about the impact of it. So that's kind of where it started for me. And then when Chris and I went into circuit, first of all, years ago, um, we always used to do a deal in that I would prepare things for Maundy Thursday and Chris would prepare material for Good Friday. And it was a few years into doing that that she wrote a series called Stations of the Cross, which we used in church. Hang on, I better just see if this is somebody who's trying to get on and can't. Give me a second. Okay, two more people joining. They were stuck in the waiting room, but I now can see them. Okay, so Chris wrote it, and so uh, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we get there. But that was part of my journey of finding artworks associated with Stations of the Cross. So what we're going to do each night is two or three or four, I think, on one evening pictures. Um, and I just thought these little ones on the right-hand side were really fascinating. The one you're looking at the right-hand side of the screen there is a bit like a sort of cartoon strip. I do have a wonderful book which I haven't got dug out, and I think I did show you a picture or two from it with some of you before, where the Eagle Annual did the whole of the Gospels on their back page in cartoon form, and it did remind me of that. And this one is much more artistic, different images, and although I haven't used these specifically, I was quite taken by the colorway of it. But I was interested to, as I was working through it, just finding out what it was all about and how Stations of the Cross came about. We know that we use them for devotions. We know that we can use them in the um, in services, in acts of worship. We can use it for personal devotions. Um, but actually, what I was interested to see was that it started really with the Franciscans back in the 14th century. And at that time, Jerusalem was occupied following the Crusades. And the Franciscans had sort of taken over doing, if you like, the Thomas Cook tours. And so they had the responsibility of looking after the holy places. And indeed, some of those they still do. And in order to aid the visitors' devotions, they set up little tableaux, first of all, around um, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and then more through the streets. And the idea, and you can still do it if you go to Jerusalem, and some of you might have done it, is that you now walk from the Praetorium, which is where Pilate would have put Jesus on trial, through the streets and arrive at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is reputedly the site of the crucifixion. And everybody says it's absolutely wonderful because you can walk along the streets where Jesus went, except you can't, because the streets where Jesus was are about 17 meters lower down, because there's been so much change and destruction over the years that different layers have been built up. So you are walking roughly in the right place, but not on the exact places. Stations of the Cross traditionally are 12 or sometimes as many as 14, but there are different versions of them. And I've gone for what you might call the most traditional set. Sometimes it can be as few as 5. There's even one that I've seen that's as many as 36. So, but 14 has been established as a tradition since 1731 with Clement II, Pope Clement II. 9 of them follow the Bible stories, the accounts, and another 5 of them are by what's called popular devotion, i.e., they're not mentioned in the Bible, but you can imagine it happening. And that's particularly around some of the little myths, little stories associated with Jesus that have found their way. We'll come to Veronica. And then secondly, around Jesus falling down, there are 3 falls, and those are not part of the story. But I thought it might be helpful just to set ourselves into context. And I'm going to read just a little bit from Matthew chapter 20, sorry, from Mark chapter 15, which is the story of Jesus being tried, because the first pictures that we're going to look at tonight are Jesus is condemned to death. As morning came, so this is the morning of Good Friday, the whole council, chief priests, elders, and scribes made their plans. They bound Jesus and led him away to hand him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked him. "The words are yours," he replied. And the chief priests brought many charges against him. Pilate questioned him again. "Have you nothing to say in your defense? You see how many charges they're bringing against you." But to Pilate's astonishment, Jesus made no further reply. At the festival season, the governor used to release one prisoner requested by the people. As it happened, a man named Barabbas was then in custody with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. When the crowd appeared and began asking for the usual favor, Pilate replied, "Would you like me to release the king of the Jews?" For he knew it was out of malice that Jesus had been handed over to him. But the chief priests incited the crowd to ask instead for the release of Barabbas. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what shall I do with the man you call King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why? What wrong has he done?" Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." So Pilate, in his desire to satisfy the mob, released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and then handed him over to be crucified. So, as we start this journey, we'll do so with a prayer. Almighty and everlasting God, who in your tender love towards the human race sent your Son, our Saviour Jesus Christ, to take upon him our flesh and to suffer death upon the cross, grant that we may follow the example of his patience and humility, and also be made partakers of his resurrection. Through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Amen. That prayer comes from an Anglican publication of a few years ago, which walks the way of the cross. Actually starts a little earlier. It starts back on Maundy Thursday. So I've only picked it up with the beginning of that story from them. There are 3 writers in the book: Stephen Cottrell, now Archbishop of York; Paula Gooder, a well-known and established theologian; and Philip North, now Bishop of Blackburn. And the works of art are by this man, Nicholas Markel. And he very simply, in just 3 colours, black, white, and red, depicts the story, and we will see more of his work as we go through. I think they're probably done as cuts, as lino cuts, and then overprinted. But he starts back in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you have all sorts of imagery going on here, don't you? You have Jesus bowing his head in prayer. You have the cup overflowing, but overflowing with blood. You have the hint of the crown of thorns. You have the moon to show that it is night. And that's what I want to encourage you to do as we go through these pictures, to look at them and to say what you can see. So I'll stop at various points, and please, what I've always said on these evenings is stop me and buy one. If there's something you want to say, either wave your hand, because I'm looking at most of you, or just speak up and interject. There are no rights and wrongs about this. Anybody is welcome to share their insights and understandings. But the traditional first stop is Jesus is condemned. And the first artwork that I came across in association with the Stations of the Cross, other than going to Catholic churches and seeing what are often quite simple little marks around the world, sometimes just simply the numbers, was this little book, Walk With Me. So after Chris had written her Stations of the Cross, we wanted to do something to illustrate them, and I came across this little book in SBCK, and there were a set of posters to go with it. And they're based, as it says here, by the stations, which are in the Church of Christ the King in Steyning in Hampshire. They were commissioned in 1993 by Gerald Coates. Some of you might know Gerald Coates' writings. He's an evangelical high church Anglican, if that's a reasonable way of describing him. And he wanted to put into his church a series of Stations of the Cross. And if I go to the next picture, you will see on the left are the pictures that were done in the book and they're done on the posters. On the right is how they are in the church. So the wooden blocks are flat back. Yes, Ben?
I can't see.
What can't you see?
The pictures.
At all?
No.
What can you see?
I can see the screen, but it says zoom on it.
Ah. I presume everybody else can see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I can
Okay.
see.
So somewhere, Ben, it should say view, and you might be able to clear it so you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
You can see the pictures or just see the zoom?
I can see the zoom bit.
Right, but you can't see the pictures.
And the pictures as well.
And the pictures as well. Right. If you go to where it says view, just go on the bit that says speaker, then you'll only get me. Or you might just get, or go to full screen. Can you see what I mean? Well, I'll move on slowly and you see if you can press a button that makes it do what you want it to do. So
it's come up, and that's all.
Right. I don't know what to suggest, I'm sorry. So the right-hand picture is of the wood block affixed to the wall. They look circular, but they've got a flat back so that they're fixed to the wall. And one of the things that this person wanted to do, Shawcross, he wanted to depict the people involved without marked faces in order for us to put our own faces in their place. So even in the place of Jesus, but certainly there, as you see, in the place of Pilate, who is on the right-hand side, who's got his bowl in front of him for washing his hands. And then on the left-hand side, a very obvious soldier carrying a gun. And it did strike me as I was looking at these pictures again this time, as we are focusing our hearts and minds on Israel and Palestine, how this scene must be played out in different ways at the moment. with Palestinians and being taken and interrogated, and those who are still held as hostages on the Jewish side. And it seemed to me as we go through this set of pictures through the different nights that Chris's Shawcross, although these were done, as I say, in 1993, so nearly just over 30 years ago, they are incredibly up to date, and you'll see others that I think are even more suggestive of what's going on at the moment. Ben, have you managed to see us any better?
Yeah, I can see.
Good. Okay. Another set of wooden stations come from this set, which is called the forest stations. The forest stations are now in Lincoln Cathedral, down one of the side walls, and they are about 4 or 5 feet high, so they're quite substantial. They went on tour when he first put them together, and I'll tell you a little bit about William Fairbank on another occasion. But he's used, as you can see there, 139 different timbers, not in every one, but if I move to the next picture, you will see how intricate the work is. So if the whole thing is about 4 feet high, then think about how small some of those individual figures are, particularly up here underneath the hand. This is the hand of Pilate. This is Jesus depicted by the halo. This is the crowd all shaking their fists, waving their hands, voting for Jesus to be crucified and for Barabbas to be freed. You can see how intricate his work is. I hate to think how long it took him to make them. It records it was only in a few months, but it must have been very intensive work to do all the marquetry. And you'll see that some of it is flat to the surface. So the individual figures of the people are flat to the surface, but the hand and Jesus are both raised from the surface. So they've got a certain three-dimensional quality to them as well. But you begin to see how the different artists picking up on really a very simple statement, Jesus is condemned to death, then begin to put their own take on it. And William Fairbank, a bit like the work of Chris Shawcross that we've just seen, also becomes more modern in his interpretation. And as you see, has added into the text of what it is about, is condemned to death by the crowd through the government. And we'll see a bit more of that in in some of his later work, how he wants to identify the government as having responsibility in this. And one of the things that I'll share with you later on is he's very direct about that involvement. Another cathedral and another set of stations. These come from Southwell Cathedral or Southwell, or depending on how you want to say it. Having been in the diocese, we always said Southwell, but local people often did say Southwell or Southwell. These are very different because these are aluminium on oak, oak being the base that they're standing on, and they are cast aluminium. I'm not entirely sure what the artist used when he was first making them, because obviously they must have been made in something else before a casting being made. But they stand about 3 foot high off the ground and about 12 inches by 18 inches rectangular. And therefore you get a lot more depth of picture to it. And you begin to use the different elements that he wants to bring in. It's all very angular. You might almost describe it as brutal in every sense. He's a bit like Chris Shawcross in that the people don't have faces. They are just simple cut-out shapes of the body and a round oval for the head. And you begin to identify where Jesus is. And I've got 2 sets of photographs because when I took these photographs myself, you had to sort of keep moving around in order to see what was going on. So working from the bottom forward, you have 2 soldiers who are around Jesus. Jesus has got his head bowed, standing before Pilate. And, well, is it the Sanhedrin? Is it the Roman authorities? It's definitely people in government sitting behind and looking on and wondering, perhaps wondering what's happening, perhaps goading Pilate on to what's happening. So again, we'll come back to some more of these works later on.
Isn't it great about metal sculpture? How when people touch it,
Yeah.
it shines up.
Yeah, yeah, you can imagine people
So
have been touching their heads.
yeah.
Yeah, people,
And
you can't stop it.
Jesus is more worn than the rest.
He is. And of course, all the time it's worn, it's made smooth, and that kind of takes some of the brutality out of it. It's quite interesting that they have that. Yes, as you say, Jesus is more marked, more touched. The set of pictures I've been aware of for quite a while are those from the Benedictine Sisters of Turvey Abbey. You might have seen some of these. Again, they were done as a set of posters, and I know a number of Methodist churches have had them. In my last appointment, we put these outside the church and varied them as we went through Lent. Turvey Abbey sisters were also the people who illustrated the Methodist worship book. So if you've seen what they used to call the children's version, which I really objected to because it seemed to me it was for everybody, their work, which I often have on the screen when I'm taking communion services, that's the Turvey Abbey sisters' artistic work. Have a look at that and tell me what you can see.
I can see a crown.
You can see a
crown.
A crown, that's right. Jesus has got the crown of thorns on his head. Yep.
See the cockerel on the left-hand side?
That's right. So not part of the story at this moment, but an allusion back to Peter. Peter saying, I won't deny you, but of course he does. Yeah.
I remember when Peter was on the cross, he was upside down.
That's what they say, isn't it? Yes. Because Peter says that he wasn't good enough to be crucified the same way as Jesus was. Thank you, Ben.
Okay.
I think
there's lots of sort of pointing, accusations, and fists. So it looks quite aggressive at the bottom.
Yeah. And think where we are standing, how we are looking at that picture. So effectively, that could be our hands. The artists are saying, are you pointing the finger? Are you shaking your fist? Are you causing Jesus's condemnation? Which, of course, takes us back to the reading where it is the crowd who, in the end, condemn Jesus to death, neither the Jewish nor the Roman authorities, but the people themselves. And then in the background, there's just sort of imagery of Jerusalem, of a Palestinian city with the square blocks. Remember making those as children in Sunday school, cutting out your little shapes and making them into little houses. We looked, I think, last year at some of the work of Aurelia Clark, and I think I showed you a few of these, but she did a series of Stations of the Cross. Just briefly, for those who weren't part of us, Aurelia Clark's got a couple of works in the Methodist Art Collection. The only works that she ever sold are in the Methodist Art Collection. She was heavily involved with the Catholic Church, and she gave this series of pictures to the local priest. They haven't all survived, but they've all been recorded so that we can have a picture of them all. And the family have gradually tried to gather them all back together and use them more. But again, if you look at this, you can see where we are in relation to Jesus. So Jesus is facing away from us. The crowd is beyond him. I haven't counted how many faces there are, but lots of crowds, mouths are open, people are shouting. There's a soldier with his sword into the back of Jesus, and Jesus is bound, his hands are bound together. And then if you look, there are actually two different pictures. Can you see the difference? Spot the difference between the left-hand one and the right-hand one?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the left-hand side is Pilate with his very Roman nose. And on the right-hand side is him washing his hands and declaring that he has nothing to do with this. It's not his fault what's going to happen. So very often, Ada Clark did do different versions of the same picture, came back to it, partly for herself and partly because she would come back to things a few years later and then would do a slightly different take on what she was showing. As I was preparing for this, I picked up a few books which have different readings and sayings, different meditations and prayers based around the Stations of the Cross. And this comes from a book by Margaret Adams Parker as the artist. And I'm just reaching to find you to tell you that Catherine Sonderegger, a lot of them come out of America, is the writer. And the subtitle is Finding Hope in a Weary Land. And you'll find that the pictures of this person as we go through them are not just sad, but really quite depressed and depressing. There are two different pictures, but again, they're the same image. On the left-hand side, a full length of Jesus. On the right-hand side, more a close-up of it. The point, of course, is Ecce Homo, is behold the man. In one of the gospel stories, Pilate brings Jesus out in front of the crowd and says, look, here he is, behold the man, Ecce Homo. And if when you have the opportunity to go to Israel and to make the journey of the Stations of the Cross through Jerusalem, then Ecce Homo is one of the places you go to. It's the starting point of the journey. And you, again, supposedly are standing on the Praetorium steps on the pavement where Pilate was with Jesus. I think in that case, it's probably slightly more likely because of where it is in the city than when you get further on in the journey.
Do you think it's significant the way he's got his hands? You know, sort of, you would do that for communion, wouldn't you?
Yes, and it's interesting because if you go back to the one before, then most of what we looked at, the hands are tied behind Jesus's back, and in this one they're tied in front. I always find it interesting if you watch cop shows on television, whether they put the handcuffs on in front of them or behind them. Americans tend to do it behind and we tend to do it in front. But I think you're right. There is almost open hands as well, aren't there? It's partly, as you say, Helen, how we would have our hands to receive. But I think it's also Jesus offering. This is how, if you had something in your hands you were giving away, you would also have them open in front of you. And my guess is that she's trying to depict something where Jesus is offering even himself to us. Thank you. Another book that's come out of America is by this artist, Noyes Capehart. And he has done, these are woodcuts and then printed. He made about 25 copies of each print. If you look in the small print at the bottom, it's got the number of the print. But there are interesting things in this. I encourage you to look very closely and tell me why you think I smiled when I looked at this picture. I'm sorry they're small, but they're about as big as I can make them. I'll focus in a bit on it.
Is it the cat?
It is the cat. So, hang on. Oh, have you seen the cat?
Yeah.
Why a cat? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I can see a cat.
Yeah. And as we go through the pictures of his through the next few weeks, you'll see different animals. There's a dog in one and other things as well. what's interesting, and we've already seen it a little bit in some of the other pictures, is at
Yes,
what
there's that
point do
picture.
you depict what's going on? So there's elements of this that might be trying to picture something from 2000 years ago. But I think there were probably more elements getting back to sort of Renaissance artists. Look at the way that the man on the right-hand side is dressed and the soldier on the left-hand side. That's not what I traditionally think of as being Roman costume or Jewish costume in the time of Jesus. So he kind of is playing with different ideas, and I get a feeling, and again, you'll see more of his work later, that he's kind of
Gone.
what's gone.
The whole thing went on my screen. Went
Oh.
up to your screensaver.
Oh, we'll just tap it.
I think
Oh, wait. Sorry, my picture's gone.
everything's gone.
Right. Can other people see me?
Yeah, I can still see the screen, your
That's all
screen.
right. Okay. I'll go and sort Christine out in a second. She's in the other room. I don't know why that is. So I think he's trying to sort of get something of Renaissance artists and something of that nature of what's going on. Let me just go and see if I can sort Christine out while you look at this one, which is the second picture by Nicholas Markel. Remember the first picture we started with? I'm back. Sorry, don't know what's happened. She's going to come and join me here. Okay, so what can you see in this picture?
It almost looks like Jesus is standing in front of the tomb.
Yeah. Yeah, I wondered if it was almost like a coffin, though it's slightly pointed at the top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see this, Peter?
I can, Ben. Is that yours?
Yeah.
Ben showing me a crucifix that he's got, which is showing Jesus on the cross.
The three figures, the three heads are identical, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I don't know whether that's significant, but yes. Yeah. And Jesus is not bound. I mean, his hands are free in this picture.
It's the two on one side are the ones that are condemning, and then the one on the other side is maybe sticking up for Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's like what's that word? I got a picture called Ascension.
Say that again, Ben.
It's called Ascension of
Yes,
Jesus.
it does look a bit like an ascension picture, doesn't it? Yeah. But this is part of, they've used more imagery through the story in this book because they take more stations before we get to the condemnation by Pilate. But this is Pilate. And I have to say, I really warmed to this one when I saw it. I thought this was a really clever imagery.
Oh, that's very clever.
So there's Pilate at the background and Jesus in front, and one superimposed on the other. I found that really moving. And even the way that the hair of Jesus is reflected in the robe of Pilate. And of course, he's using that the wand of office that was well known standard that the Roman centurions, the Roman authorities would carry to show that they got authority over what was to be done and said.
And also in the Bible, in the when you read it in the Gospels, the conversation with Pilate is not necessarily, it's more a conversation than a condemnation, isn't it?
It is. Yes. I mean, I read it from the Markan version. And in Mark, Jesus doesn't say anything, which is quite unusual because you thought Jesus would say something. But in Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't answer at all. He says nothing. Whereas if you go to Matthew and Luke, and more particularly with John, then you get much more interaction and conversation. And that's why over the centuries, people have sort of picked up on different things, both in these Stations of the Cross and in other artistic works, and indeed in musicals and so on as well. What is going on in Pilate's head at this point? He's at one level, he's trying to absolve himself of responsibility by getting the crowd. At another level, he's intrigued by Jesus, wants to know what it's all about. I mean, I still think Jesus Christ Superstar did an excellent job in making you think about Pilate and Herod and the crowd and everybody else and the reactions to Jesus. And I think that's what these artists are doing. They're bringing out the different aspects of the story. And they're not necessarily doing it from one gospel. They're doing it more generally from the story. But I think you're right, Graham. They're picking out that interaction, that overlay, really, of the conversation. But all the while, the red is kind of saying there's blood coming into this. It's about death as well as about life. And another of his, because as I say, they take 3 or 4 pictures to get through this part of the story. Jesus is scourged and crowned with thorns. And I think you begin to get something of the violence of it. The scourging would have been probably with what we might call a cat o' nine tails. They would have something that was a set of strings, probably with little metal spikes on the end. May have originally been thorns, but that would have torn into the flesh and done a great deal of damage. And of course, the crown is there hovering over his head. And again, it's in red because blood is going to flow. I just wanted to take you back again a couple of years to things I showed before, and the pictures of Stanley Spencer. And this is the disrobing and the robing of Jesus. And you have that imagery of Jesus with his clothes being taken off. Jesus is bound and blindfolded. But I wanted to make the point, and it related back to the Markel, to this, but in the disrobing and then the robing, Stanley Spencer is picking up on the sheer abuse that Jesus goes through. We always, of course, know that the death on a cross was something very brutal, something really awful. But I think in looking at these pictures and thinking about it more clearly, you begin to understand more of what was happening and the way Jesus was being denigrated, was being abused, was being put on the spot by what was happening. Normally, when we see a crucifixion picture, Jesus is naked because the Roman soldiers would have crucified a naked person. So what Jesus is going through with being disrobed and then re-robed is part of his humiliation. And it's interesting because in that way, when we see the Stations of the Cross and Jesus making his way, he has clothes on. And it's not until we get to the moment of crucifixion that the robe is finally taken off him. So that's unusual in the sense of what would have happened at the time. They would have been naked men who would have been dragged through the streets. But in an odd way, I think, it was even worse abuse than just being dragged there naked, because he was dressed up. He was made into a puppet figure, a clown figure. Then people would have been laughing as well as hurling insults at him. This comes from a very different series of works. This actually comes from a series that was done quite early on in internet pictures. And so I haven't got there was a series called Stations of the Cross, but they aren't the traditional 14 stations. But I just wanted to show you this because it's quite a different piece of art. But it's still art, in my opinion. And you still very much get that sense of condemnation, don't you? The pointing fingers and what's going on. So it just shows the range of interpretations that different artists have put on what is just the same bit of the story. And just a couple of other pictures. I picked these up through one of the blogs that I follow, an American lady who does an art and theology, not quite a daily blog, but certainly quite frequently in the week and around the special festival time. And this came out of a series that was put on in one of the American galleries. And they wanted to depict the 12 stations of the 14 stations of the cross, but they did them with pictures that they already owned and did them by trying to sort of come at it slightly at a tangent. And I'll show you another one of that series in a moment. But this is Henry Asawa Tanner. And if you were with me back in Advent, I showed 2 or 3 of his pictures. An American black artist, as you see, of the earlier 20th century, but has a very ethereal way of depicting things. The picture that I showed you back in Advent was of Mary huddled back on the bed and a bright light depicting Gabriel in front of her. This is his interpretation of the Saviour, but it is said to be his image of Christ before Pilate. So his head is slightly bowed. He's prepared for his fate, his doom. And then one from the Methodist Art Collection. This is by Susie Hamilton, a very striking image called Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, that we saw earlier. It's acrylic on canvas, but she's done it in such a way that, as you can see, particularly the dark is quite thickly painted. So there's a lot of texture to it. And you kind of can see the figure, but you can't see the figure. You kind of know it's Jesus, but you don't know it's Jesus. The hands are open, some of the things we've been talking about earlier. And Jesus, of course, is more light than substance, maybe even more ghost than substance. So I think she's put all sorts of different ideas into what she's doing. So that brings us to the end of that first section. And I hope what I'm going to go on to do is not going to be too repetitive, because I think you will see something of the different interpretations coming out. But I wanted to do that with some detail because it both introduces you to the Stations of the Cross, but more importantly, it introduces you to the artists that we're going to be looking at. Because what I'm going to do now is go through the second station and through the different artists' interpretation of what the next station is. And the next station is Jesus carrying his cross. So we go back to Chris Shawcross and those amazing wooden pieces. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see how big a brick is. So that whole thing is just 5 bricks high. So if you imagine 5 bricks, you're talking about a foot or 15 inches high. So it's got amazing detail in something that really is very, very small. And here again, you have Jesus carrying the cross, Jesus with a crown of thorns, a very modern soldier in the background. And Of course, the question always is when you see these things, and you'll see it in everything that we look at in a moment, is what did Jesus actually carry? The theory actually is that Jesus would have only carried the crossbar, partly because a cross would have just been too big and unwieldy, partly because they say that they left the verticals in the ground and the crossbar was attached to each person and hauled into place. So whereas we normally see these imageries of Jesus actually carrying a cross, it probably wasn't going to be exactly like this, but then it wasn't exactly like this anyway, was it? In Preston, on Good Friday, we did a processional walk through the city, and they had a cross there that was about 15 foot high, made of a very substantial piece of wood. If you think about sort of railway sleeper dimensions, but 15 feet high, it took 4 or 5 people to carry it. It was really quite impressive. And there was almost a fight from different men who wanted to have the opportunity to carry the cross because it had so much power and meaning in the symbolism of it. And I was always pleased if I took my turn because you just felt that you were doing something that Jesus had done. We'll pause a little longer on William Fairbank's work. Number 2, he's changed the language slightly: beaten, flogged, and carrying the cross. So you can begin to see why he's renamed it. Here he is only carrying the crossbar. And if you look, Jesus' hands are already bound to the crossbar, or at least the bindings are there, and that's how Jesus is carrying it. And these are strips that are inlaid into the wood. So I don't know whether they're leather or strips of willow perhaps that have been folded around. And then on his back, you can see the flog marks. And again, I'll see if I can make it slightly bigger. But if you think each of those colours is an individual piece of wood, again, the time that it's taken to do that is really quite astonishing. But if you notice, if I go back, hang on. Oh, no, that's it. This piece of wood is very similar to the one that he uses in the first image, but it's now become more of a walk. It's now become more of a path. So you get that sense of Jesus walking along and carrying the cross and being bowed down by the weight of it. I think he very effectively, both with this very substantial log that is on Jesus' shoulders and the way the head is cramped behind it, he manages to almost overwhelm Jesus with the weight of it. I'm going to pause here and just Christine's going to read one of her meditations. We were saying that she wrote these back in, I think it was 1987, and we have used them everywhere that we've been. I used them in this circuit, I think in 2021, when we did a YouTube series for Good Friday because we weren't able to be together in church in quite the way we wanted to be. But I've asked her if she'll read the second one, which is Jesus bears his cross. And I'll get her to explain a little bit about the background to it and what you're going to do in reading it.
There is a background.
Well, you wrote it, you know what
Yes,
it's about.
yes. Oh, well, hopefully it's fairly obvious.
Yes.
It's really thinking about what a cross is made of and what it was like, really.
And at the end, go on, you'll say at the end.
At the end of the reflection, there is a couple of lines that everybody can say together to make it a prayer for them as well. And I think you've got those on the screen, haven't you?
Yeah, that'll come up there at the end in italic and bold.
So we'll say those words together. So station number 2, Jesus bears his cross. I watched his father Joseph as he fashioned the boy's cradle. His cradle was made of the finest wood, well seasoned, well shaped, well joined, fashioned with love and skill. But sometimes he protested when Mary laid him in it to sleep. The circle of her arms was his choice. His cross is made of the cheapest timber, still green, rough-hewn, world-heavy, made by greedy, expedient men. Yet he does not protest when it is laid upon his shoulders for him to bear. Is this what he has chosen? Look, Heavenly Father, at your Son, with the cross you give him to bear for the world.
Jesus said,
Jesus said,
take up
"Take
your
up your
cross
cross
and follow
and
me.
follow me.
Give us the
Give us the
strength, Lord,
strength, Lord,
to
to
obey
obey
your
your
commands."
command."
One of the things that I have noticed, been intrigued and often commented on in churches is that we beautify the cross. As Chris says in that meditation, the cross was made of the cheapest timber, rough hewn. If you look at the cross in the church, it's usually plain to within an inch of its life. It's varnished and polished and made into something beautiful. And you will see, as I see going around the circuit, different crosses in different places, Trinity's being a very notable one. In one of my churches, John Fiddler, who some of you will know by name, he was involved with Methodists Alongside the Poor Fund some years ago, got very fed up by crosses being beautiful at Easter, and took his time to get some very rough wood and to make one that we would always bring out on Good Friday and place on the communion table. Because in a way, by beautifying the cross, although it is a beautiful thing that Jesus did for us, and we want to say that the cross is something special and important, I do think we, in a way, by sort of take the power out of it, or at least the brutality out of it, we make it into something that is very easy and on the eye, and you would think very easy on the body. Whereas it would have been such a rough thing that even just being nailed to the cross, not just the nails, but just touching the wood, would have been awful in terms of splinters and jagged edges, and the way that would have impinged upon Jesus, both in the carrying and in the crucifixion. I told you earlier about what we did in Preston, and I think I don't think that person has ever seen it, but you do get a slightly different impression here, in that this cross is probably more lifelike in terms of its overall size. Just think of the end of the life of Brian and everybody in the crucifixion scene there. And the crosses, of course, are very high. They're probably 15 or 20 foot off the ground by the time they're hanging up there. It would have been a spectacle. They would have been placed there so that everybody could see what was happening. And actually, in this imagery from Southwark Cathedral, Jesus is carrying the cross, and so is another person. And this is not Simon of Cyrene. We'll come to that later on. This is probably one of the soldiers just having to carry the weight of it because Jesus himself could not cope with it. Or if he was carrying it on his own, just think of the weight of that on his shoulders and dragging along the ground, bumping over the paving stones as he made his way. And again, a bit like the Forest Stations cross, you begin to see the path opens up. So Jesus has been in the Praetorium with Pilate, and now the road opens for him to walk to Calvary. By contrast, I think in some ways this picture from Turvey Abbey is a little more gentle. If you notice, the cross isn't even on Jesus's shoulder. He's sort of holding it in midair, which is, he must be really strong to do that. If you tried to hold anything of any weight that high, his arms would have been aching from a second on. But I think they're making the point that actually the cross is something of beauty, something of salvation, something of God's glory. So although Jesus has the halo around his head, it's almost as if the cross has the halo around it as well. The soldiers are there they're the darkness, they're the bad things at the bottom. And of course, not quite in the right place, but there are elements here that are something closer to a Celtic cross with the orb around it as well, and we'll see an image of that later on. Ilaria Clark's imagery, much more with the brutality of it. Jesus is beginning to take the weight. The man here, if you can see his hand, has got his hand under it. He's beginning to help Jesus to lift it and stand up. I love the brutality of this man's face. He's really angry. He's red with anger. Or this image behind with the teeth bared. There's real venom in what's going on. Interesting in this one that Jesus is carrying the cross the other way from the way that we would normally depict it. It's a much smaller cross. It wouldn't have borne his weight if he was to be crucified. However, in the background, two crosses already in place, waiting for the third, called the place of the skull. If you've been to Jerusalem, you go to two places that are possible sites for the crucifixion. One is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and one is a garden just on the outskirts of the city, without the city wall. It's only a Victorian invention, but it's said that that rock there has the imagery of a skull in it. It's limestone, so it's white like a skull, and there's supposed to be caves in it that make it look like eyes and a nose and a mouth. And again, for the modern series, a tiny little cross, but I think this gets over something of the way in which Jesus is suffering, sweat and blood pouring down his head as he takes the weight. Imagine you've done a workout, that you're carrying something heavy. You've gone only a few hundred yards, and already you're beginning to feel fatigued. This was a second picture from the Smithsonian Gallery that they put on, and this was the one that's associated with Jesus carrying his cross. It's a picture, as you can see, of a black man looking down a road, and who knows why he's making the journey. But I do think when these pictures are put alongside the story, they themselves take on new meaning. So you have the tree behind the man. Don't forget how often would black people be lynched and strung up on a tree, part of the brutality of slave era and racism since. Leaving behind a little shack in the background and setting off on a road. He's sitting on a little wooden box. Perhaps he's deciding whether he can leave or not. But I do think it's interesting when you juxtapose some other imagery against the traditional ones, that it begins to take us to a different place, another place. The tree, I think, is almost like a person, isn't it? Bending over, as if that on the left-hand side, it's almost an arm bending and coming towards the man, perhaps to embrace him, perhaps to cause him pain and anguish. And I couldn't resist putting this picture in again. We looked at this over the last couple of years when we've done the Holy Week story. Stanley Spencer, Christ carrying the cross. This, if you remember what I told you, this is his family home in Cookham, and it's the the lace curtains that are blowing out of the window, making it look like angels' wings. Jesus, of course, is carrying the cross in the middle of the picture. Let's make it a bit bigger here. And the soldiers are the ones with the caps on, the women of Jerusalem that we'll come to later in the story. And of course, that's matched by these two men carrying their ladders and making it look like the people carrying the cross behind as well. And so the third picture, the third imagery on the Stations of the Cross is the first fall. And there are 3 falls in the story. They don't appear in the gospel at all, but it's something, it gives you that sense as you make the journey of it getting nearer and nearer. So in the first fall, Jesus is still just sort of stumbling. You'll see later in the second fall, he's towards the ground, and in the third fall, he's on the ground. But it gives you that sense of movement just overall. And I think that's why these 3 stations have been put in to the story, in order to give that sense of movement, of coming closer, Jesus getting towards his end. I said I was going to show you a Celtic cross. This is also by Chris Shawcross. As you can see, it is from St Aidan's Cross in Bradford Cathedral. I've not actually seen it. Having found about it, I'm very inclined to go. It's about 4 foot high. And I'll just read you a little bit about what it says. If I can find the right bit, 1 second. Just to remind you, St Aidan was the one who took Christianity to Northumberland. So he's the one who set up Lindisfarne Priory. He worked alongside Oswald, Northumbrian king, who had his fortress at Bamborough, not the fortress we see now, but an early forerunner on that site. And so he lived around the end of the 6th into the 7th century, so 590 through to 651, an Irish monk and missionary. There had been Christianity in Northumberland earlier, which had come from the south, from Paulinus, coming up from Canterbury. So going back to the story of Gregory sending over missionaries to Canterbury and then making their way north. But Oswald and his predecessors had turned against Christianity and went back to pagan ways. And then Aidan arrived from Ireland and probably from Iona as well, and founded the monastery on Lindisfarne, and basically did a deal with the king that the king would be saved if he allowed a monastery to be established. And Oswald's Northumbrian kingdom was really quite small, but it was an important place between England and Scotland. So and a site where people would often be travelling past. So it was a very important place for him to be. But on this imagery, and again, Shawcross has used very much the same sort of pictures as we saw on his wooden sculptures. So it says on the left-hand arm of the cross are images from today, people in need across the globe in developing countries. And you can see, again, I'll see if I can make it a bit bigger. I was struggling a bit to get this into any detail. 1 second. So you can see people, there's a woman carrying a child. There's a woman down on her knees begging for food. There's a traveller who's got a staff and a bag. And then on the other side, on this side, on the right-hand side, are images of people struggling for equality and freedom from suffering and want in the modern developed world. So the left-hand side, the developing world, the right-hand side, the developed world. And people coming forward with placards and banners asking for freedom, people crawling on their knees, and people running to find help, running obviously towards the centre of the cross and towards Jesus. Centre of the cross uses that old Celtic symbol for the Trinity, which we see in a number of places in Northumberland and in Iona and so on. And then at the bottom, let's see if I can move it across. This is more hopeful. So the lower part of the cross shows people of the past, the present, and the future who are sharing their faith and journeying towards God. And can you make out that you've got a person here helping another person to climb up, doing that thing where you put your hands out like a step for somebody to step on? People are climbing up the walls, they're climbing upwards and upwards until they're coming towards Jesus, towards the Trinity in the center. And then at the top, and I'm sorry, there were only 3 pictures of this on the internet, and they were all very dark at the top. Obviously, the lighting isn't good. But here you have Oswald, the king, on his knees praying, and Aidan, the missionary, with his bishop's staff behind, giving him a blessing as Oswald comes to faith, and he allows Aidan to establish that so important community. I just thought it was interesting to look at this piece of work alongside Christy Shawcross's other work to see how he's used that same faceless but very personal imagery and invites us to put our faces onto the people and to think about them. And I just linked these two together as well. The bottom of this Chris Shawcross picture is of people climbing up, whereas in this picture from the Forest series in Lincoln Cathedral, it's of people falling down. So this is also about 4 foot high, but here's Jesus carrying the crossbeam, just exactly the same imagery as in the previous one. But beneath him, people are falling and tumbling down into the earth. And you'll see that rather than a flat sheet, he's hollowed out the inside of a trunk. And so it's sort of like a pipe or a tunnel down into the ground. And that's picking up on the imagery that when Jesus dies on the cross, that's picked up in some of Paul's writings and the Acts of the Apostles about Jesus going into Hades or hell in order to save the people who have already died. And I think what William Fairbank is trying to do is to show that these people have fallen down into the pit, down into Hades or Sheol, as it's sometimes called, the land of darkness, the land where people reside before Jesus comes to save them. And then Jesus will go down and join them and then help them to come out again. And then back to Southwell Cathedral, and Jesus is stumbling. I just put this one in partly because it just show you, and I'll show you a better photograph of the imagery, but can you see how the 3 are all lined up? So we're gradually, the story is proceeding as you walk down the aisle. Jesus is on his knees. The cross is now down on the ground. Indeed, it sticks lower than the ground, down into the ground. He's stumbled up these steps, and the people are watching on. So you have adults, male, female, and 2 children looking on. And again, like so many of these pictures, the artist is inviting you to look into the picture and to take your place alongside others, seeing what's happening. This one is I haven't put the picture in, but this is also reminiscent of one of Stanley Spencer's pictures. Do you remember the picture of the soldiers dying and coming back to life? And he has a whole series of different crosses overlaying with each other, which are the images of the cross. Oh, thank you, Ben. Yes, I can see it. He uses the images of the cross being the grave markers for those who have died. And I think the Benedictine sisters are doing something similar by overlaying cross upon cross within this picture. So Jesus is carrying his cross, but there are other crosses here as well, some of which are a struggle to carry, bowed down, some of which are finer and Perhaps you could imagine yourself carrying one. Maria Clark's imagery, the brutality not just of him falling underneath the cross, but the cross is coming down on top of other people, and then somebody's putting the boot in, quite literally, there. We've got a dog this time and not a cat. But maybe the dog is licking up the blood, reminiscent of the story about Jezebel. And that's it for tonight.